it really is the first. We didn't have one at all, you know. We were working when we were married.
Picked a nice cozy nook for our private talk.
Or maybe it's safer.
Lavender marriage, also known as a lavender wedding, was essentially an arranged union between a homosexual star and someone of the opposite sex. The sole purpose of these marriages was to divert public attention, protect personal image, and steer clear of scandals that could potentially destroy their careers. During Hollywood's golden era, there were records of at least 17 such marriages. Some couples rushed into the altar only 2 days after meeting. Some spent their entire lives with a spouse on paper while their hearts remained devoted to a love that could never be revealed. And there were even relationships so tangled, it is almost unbelievable a mother and daughter once married the very same man. So, who were they behind those seemingly flawless masks? What sacrifices did they have to make to preserve their reputations from collapsing? All of this will be unveiled in today's video. 1. Marlon Brando and Movida Castaneda, a marriage to conceal a secret homosexual life. In June 1960, major newspapers across the United States simultaneously splashed the headline Marlon Brando had remarried, this time to actress Movida Castaneda. Images of Brando in a neatly tailored tuxedo holding a bridal bouquet dominated the front pages, serving as a direct response aimed at quelling the rumors about his sexuality that were spreading like wildfire behind the scenes of Hollywood. Yet, behind the flashing lights of the press cameras lay an entirely different script, cold, calculated, and orchestrated step by step. Everything began when Brando became entangled in persistent rumors about secret homosexual affairs with Montgomery Clift James Dean and even his closest friend Wally Cox. At that very moment, Confidential magazine was preparing to publish a shocking exposé forcing Paramount Studios to intervene immediately. They issued an ultimatum: either get married quickly or see every active contract terminated. The wedding was staged in grand fashion, swarmed by the press with wedding photos flooding newsstands from New York to San Francisco. Movida Castaneda was chosen as the bride because she fit the role perfectly, once a star herself. Discreet, untouched by scandal, and above all, well-versed in Hollywood's shadowy machinery. But only weeks later, Brando was spotted with Wally Cox, a television comedian, and his childhood friend, leaving a small New York hotel drunk, the two of them with their arms draped around each other like lovers. And Wally was not the only one. Years later, the media would go on to expose Brando's clandestine relationships with fashion designer Jacques Azaguri, an unnamed French photographer, and even a background actor who had played a soldier in Mutiny on the Bounty, the very film that brought him together with Movida. According to the account of a close assistant, Brando and Movida never lived under the same roof, nor did they share a bedroom. Throughout their marriage, they made only one public appearance together, and that was also the last. A journalist working on the studio's PR team at the time revealed there was no love at all. That was the most carefully directed photo shoot of the year. And if Brando smiled so brightly, it was probably because he knew he had just secured his 3 blockbuster film contracts. The marriage quietly dissolved 2 years later, without lawsuits, without announcements. But Brando never stopped. He continued living with Wally Cox on and off for many years, and even left behind the request that his ashes be scattered alongside Cox's, after both had passed away, a detail that never once appeared in print. 2. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. Private letters revealing a desire that could not be named. In 1958, Hollywood witnessed one of the most admired weddings of the post-World War II era. Paul Newman, the epitome of refined masculinity on the silver screen, officially married Joanne Woodward, an Oscar-winning actress celebrated for her intelligence and discretion. Together, they quickly became the ideal couple, beautiful, talented, scandal-free, and always walking side by side on every red carpet. But there was a secret the press of the time never dared to mention. Newman had long been at the center of quiet rumors within the theater world about his sexuality. and the name most often linked to him was Stuart Stern, the screenwriter of Rebel Without a Cause, who was also Newman's close friend and longtime collaborator. At the height of his career, Newman and Stern frequently appeared together at public events, took private trips without Newman's wife and children, and most tellingly, spent long nights in a secluded lodge in the Vermont mountains. Within New York's theater circles, people whispered a single line. Just look at the way Stuart looks at Paul and you'll understand everything. Instead of distancing himself from such whispers, Newman held a full wedding ceremony in Las Vegas. The marriage took place precisely as a tabloid was preparing to run a piece questioning his ambiguous relationship with a close associate. In the years that followed, Paul and Joanne's marriage became the model of perfection. But in 2008, after Newman's death, a private collection of letters donated to the Yale Library revealed an entirely different side of the man. Among them were letters with no recipient named handwritten and never sent. What shocked researchers was the way Newman described that person with a passion and intensity that far surpassed anything he had ever written about Joanne. One letter read, "There are nights when I feel as though I am about to pour out everything in my head, but then fear stops me. I am afraid that afterward there will be nothing left, only judging eyes. You understand me more than anyone else, but I can never have you." Although there was no direct evidence to prove those letters were meant for Stern, the timing placed them in the early 1960s, the very period when Newman and Stern were working most closely, making films together, traveling together, and even being spotted having dinner alone in a secluded wooden cabin in Maine. A longtime gardener at Newman's estate once recounted that behind the private library there was a small room where Newman would sit for hours writing things no one was ever allowed to read. After his death, a metal box was discovered there containing more than 20 folded letters tied together with a blue silk ribbon. Throughout his life, Newman preserved the image of the perfect husband in public, but he also never destroyed those letters. Perhaps it was his way of keeping a part of his true self in a world that demanded constant concealment. And he may not have been the only one. For another actor, more handsome than a sculpted statue, and once expected to marry America's most beloved star, left behind a different kind of trace. But instead of letters, he chose to vanish on the eve of his wedding. 3. Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor, a wedding canceled just before the aisle. In 1956, the Hollywood Reporter newsroom received a confidential tip from someone inside the MGM studio, Montgomery Clift, and Elizabeth Taylor are secretly engaged. The wedding will take place this year. But before the story could even make it to print 3 days later, the entire plan collapsed. The wedding gown had been ordered, the guest list had been prepared, but Montgomery disappeared. Elizabeth was seen crying alone in her dressing room, her eyes swollen red without speaking a single word to anyone. No one knew what had truly happened until 1989, when Harold Mirisch, Clift's personal assistant, revealed in an interview that at exactly 2:13 a.m. on that fateful night, Monty had called him, his voice trembling. "I can't do it. I will hurt her more than anyone has ever hurt her. I don't love women the way people think." Harold pressed him. "What do you mean?" Monty sighed. "I love someone else, a man. And I won't let Elizabeth live in a cage just to shield me from the eyes of the world." The name was never spoken aloud, but within Hollywood's backstage circles, everyone knew Clift had a long-term relationship with designer Oliver Smith, who often appeared on set under the guise of being Monty's close friend. Those who knew them referred to the pair as the silent couple. Elizabeth knew. She had known everything from the start, yet she still hoped that one day he might overcome his inner doubts and love her as a man loves a woman. That hope was misplaced. A producer who had worked with them both recalled that the morning after Clift's disappearance, Elizabeth walked onto the set, looked straight into the camera, and told the director, "Just shoot. Even if my heart has nothing left to act with, She never mentioned the wedding again, not once. Afterward, Montgomery Clift sank into years of depression, alcohol, and sleeping pills. The car accident in 1956 left his face disfigured. Police reports noted no signs of braking, and many suspected he had deliberately crashed into the telephone pole. Elizabeth was the only one who came to the hospital holding his hand and staying by his side through the night. Not as a jilted bride, but as the last witness to a love that was never allowed to take shape. And what unsettled people most was that when Clift died in 1966 in his nightstand drawer, he had kept only one photograph from the height of his career. It was a picture of Elizabeth in a white wedding dress, smiling radiantly during the trial photo shoot for a ceremony that never took place. That love never truly began, but it never truly ended either. 4. James Dean and Pier Angeli. The truth hidden in the backstage dressing room. Hollywood. October 1955. All of America followed every step of the couple hailed as the brightest symbols of youth. James Dean, the young man with a defiant face and eyes that seemed to hold a storm beneath the surface, and Pier Angeli, the gentle, fragile Italian actress with a classical beauty that every American mother would have approved of for a daughter-in-law. Their wedding was held at St. Timothy's Church, attended by nearly 300 guests with dozens of photographers crowding at the gates, and at least 4 major newspapers featuring the bride and groom on their front pages the following morning. On paper, it was a dream wedding. But behind the shimmering facade, it was nothing more than an emergency contract arranged by invisible hands. At the time, James Dean was caught in a whirlwind of uncontrollable rumors, from leaked photos of him with actor Paul Newman to private parties that attendees described only as discreet, unusual, and never meant for the eyes of the press. A young journalist once tried to bring those photos to print, but was immediately summoned to the newsroom and warned, "If you want to keep working in Hollywood, destroy every draft right now." Warner Brothers, the studio that managed Dean's image, knew full well that the career of their rebel could collapse under the weight of a few whispered scandals. They quickly called Dean into a closed-door meeting. On the table lay an addendum to his contract worth $3 million, accompanied by a morality clause. If Dean failed to act decisively to end the suspicions, his contract would be suspended indefinitely, and the entire promotional campaign for Rebel Without a Cause would be halted at once. The solution came swiftly: find a suitable actress. Beautiful, spotless, and in need of restoring her reputation after a few failed projects. Pier Angeli was the perfect candidate. She was the flawless choice for a role off-screen. Their first meeting was staged at a chance party organized by Warner Brothers, where everything, from the lighting to the music, was orchestrated so that photographers could capture just the right moments of apparent intimacy. Soon after came a series of photographs of the pair strolling, going to the movies, and sipping coffee together in Beverly Hills. The fabricated love story spread across the papers, and when Variety declared James Dean to wed Italy's Golden Girl, the machine was already in full motion. The wedding was held quickly, grandly, and with every traditional ritual in place. Pier wore a French lace wedding gown, Dean a tuxedo, tailored to his exact measurements. The press called it the most perfect wedding of the year. But perhaps only the cameraman filming the ceremony noticed they never looked into each other's eyes for more than 3 seconds, and the kiss after the vows, the one that drove the press into a frenzy, had to be staged 3 times at the photographer's direction. There was no honeymoon, no holiday, no reporters allowed to follow them afterward. Just 2 days after the wedding, Dean was back on the set of Giant, as if the ceremony had never taken place. A colleague recalled, "He stayed silent the whole day. At one point, I saw James scribble something onto the inside of his script, then crush the page in his hand. He had always been mysterious, but that day, he couldn't hide his sadness." Pier remained silent. For the rest of her life, she mentioned the marriage only once during an unrecorded conversation with a close friend. That friend later recounted Pierre said she didn't love James, and James didn't love her. But both knew they needed to protect something bigger than themselves, and they agreed to step into that performance together. On September 30th, 1955, just 6 days after the wedding, James Dean drove his silver Porsche 550 Spyder out of Los Angeles, heading to Salinas to compete in a race. On the way, he crashed and died at the age of 24. His death shocked the entire nation, millions mourning little Jimmy as an idol cut down in the golden age of his youth. But few knew that inside the glove compartment of the car, police found a folded wedding photo with a handwritten note in blue ink on the back. "Thank you for helping me keep this role until the very end." 5. Anthony Perkins and Barry Berenson, a marriage to conceal the love affair with Rock Hudson. Anthony Perkins, the iconic face of American cinema known for his role as Norman Bates in Psycho, always left the public perplexed. Not because of the character he portrayed on screen, but because his real life seemed like an entirely different film, quiet, strained, and cloaked in shadows. To many, Perkins was once considered Hollywood's exception, free from scandals, never seen clinging to glamorous actresses living quietly in the midst of a film capital consumed by parties and controversies. But behind that facade lay a secret that had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. Anthony Perkins' relationship with one of America's most celebrated symbols of masculinity, Rock Hudson. The two first met in the summer of 1955 at a private party in Malibu hosted by director George Cukor, a gathering long rumored to be a clandestine haven for closeted stars. At the time, Perkins was barely in his 20s, thin, shy, and always dodging paparazzi cameras. Hudson, on the other hand, was already the king of the box office, tall, handsome, and perpetually flanked by leading ladies for publicity shots. Yet, in the shadows of that evening, they were seen sitting side by side for 2 straight hours, whispering to each other and occasionally sharing a quiet laugh. In the years that followed, they were repeatedly spotted together, leaving screenings in the same car, renting a cabin at Big Bear Lake during the winter of 1957, and most notably in a photograph of them sitting side by side on a sofa at Montgomery Clift's private birthday party. That photo, however, was hastily destroyed by an assistant director in MGM's darkroom just before it was due for release. No one confirmed anything and no one dared to ask. Yet within the industry, they were quietly referred to as the silent couple. By the early 1970s, the situation grew increasingly precarious. Confidential magazine began publishing exposés on the private lives of Hollywood's biggest stars, and Rock Hudson was directly implicated in a 1971 article titled "The King of the Screen and the Room Without Women." Perkins, who had successfully evaded the media's spotlight for nearly 2 decades, suddenly found his name surfacing in the swirl of speculation. One editor even wrote, "If Hudson is exposed, the first man to be dragged down with him will be Anthony Perkins." And it was at that very moment that a marriage was arranged. Barry Berenson, a talented photographer and granddaughter of the legendary designer Elsa Schiaparelli, was introduced to Perkins at a charity event in late 1971. Just weeks after their first public appearances together, the press unanimously declared, "At last, Perkins has found the true love of his life." Yet, behind the scenes, a close friend of Barry's later revealed in an interview, she knew everything. But Barry always said, "I love him. No matter who his heart belongs to, I still want to be by his side to protect the rest of his life." In August 1973, they were married. The ceremony was intimate, held in a small Cape Cod villa with no reporters, no cameras, and only a handful of family members in attendance. According to an old gardener throughout the entire event, Anthony barely spoke, only offering a faint smile when Barry held his hand and recited her vows. Life after marriage was peculiar. They lived in separate homes. Barry in New York, Anthony in California. They met during the holidays, had 2 sons, but rarely appeared together at major public events. Perkins continued to avoid interviews while Barry would deflect questions about her husband with nothing more than a sad smile. In 1985, Rock Hudson died after a long battle with an illness the world still hesitated to name at the time. The news exploded. Hollywood went into panic, and studios convened urgent meetings to devise emergency media policies for stars suspected of similar secrets. At the top of the list of those to be protected was Anthony Perkins. Nearly 7 years later, in September 1992, Perkins passed away. At the funeral, Barry arrived with their 2 sons. The press captured a haunting image of her standing silently before her husband's portrait, clutching something small in her hand. Rumor spread that it was a letter, perhaps from Anthony, perhaps from Hudson, but no one could ever be certain, and it was never seen again. What is known, however, is that years later, in a private conversation, Barry confided something to a close friend that brought the listener to tears. "I was the wife of a man who did not belong to me. But I've never regretted it, because I knew that in the part of his life where he could not live as his true self, I was the place he could always come home to." 6. Rock Hudson and Phyllis Gates. A marriage arranged within 48 hours to prevent a gay scandal. Rock Hudson. The golden face of Universal was hailed as America's most ideal man, standing nearly 2 meters tall with broad shoulders, a dazzling smile, and a voice as smooth as velvet. Whenever he appeared in hit films like Magnificent Obsession or All That Heaven Allows, millions of women watched in rapture. He was the ultimate symbol of masculinity in Hollywood. Yet, at the very peak of his career, everything nearly collapsed because of a single name that appeared in the draft of Confidential magazine. In the fall of 1954, Howard Rushmore, senior editor of Confidential, the scandal sheet infamous for exposing the secrets of the elite, unexpectedly received a folder from a former gardener who had once worked at Hudson's Beverly Hills mansion. Inside were handwritten letters, call notes, and a blurry photo of 2 men embracing under the dim lights of a party hosted by director George Cukor. Upon seeing it, Rushmore uttered a line that left the entire newsroom stunned. "If this is real, we can bring down all of Hollywood." Less than 24 hours later, Universal acted immediately to stop the catastrophe. That very night, Henry Wilson, Hollywood's most powerful agent at the time, and the man who had discovered Hudson in his early days, was summoned to Louis B. Mayer's office. There, a secret arrangement was drawn up. No arguments, no denials. There was only one way out: bury the scandal with a marriage. And the chosen name was Phyllis Gates. Gates was Henry Wilson's personal secretary, intelligent, discreet, and entirely free of scandal. According to journalist Liz Smith, when she was asked to become a contract wife, Gates exclaimed, "I don't know if this will really help him escape the storm, but if all anyone needs is a marriage certificate so he can live in peace, then I'll sign it." 2 days later, on November 9th, 1955, the wedding took place hastily in Santa Barbara. There was no announcement, no reporters, and not a single celebrity guest. A Universal photographer was allowed to take exactly 5 pictures, including one of Hudson smiling straight into the camera as though he had just married the love of his life. But in truth, the man who directed the entire ceremony was none other than Henry Wilson. Sitting in the back pew of the church, his eyes never left his wristwatch. The entire ritual lasted only 12 minutes. At that very moment, Confidential suddenly received an anonymous fax from an insider, warning that if they dared to touch Hudson, Universal would expose Rushmore's hidden tax evasion record from his days at the New York Daily News. The investigative series was indefinitely shelved. The scandal was buried, but the price paid was immeasurable. Only half a year after the wedding, Gates moved out to live alone in her own Westwood apartment. Hudson was constantly away on film shoots, frequently appearing alongside female co-stars to deflect suspicion. A wardrobe worker on Giant later recalled witnessing Hudson holding hands with George Nader, the actor who had been linked to him since 1948, right inside the dressing room just minutes before filming a romantic scene with Elizabeth Taylor. The marriage was so cold and lifeless that even the press began to suspect, yet Universal still tried to preserve the facade. At Christmas 1957, Hudson and Gates were forced to pose for a Happy New Year photo spread in Photoplay, even though they had already been living apart for months. In the pictures, Gates wore a white dress, her hand resting lightly on her husband's shoulder, but her gaze was vacant like a woman trapped in the lead role of a tragedy she herself could not comprehend. In 1958, Gates officially filed for divorce, citing in the paperwork betrayal of trust and loyalty. There were no lawsuits, no accusations. Hudson moved to a new house. Gates disappeared from Hollywood. The play ended in silence. It was not until 1985, when Hudson appeared before the public, gaunt, frail, and almost unrecognizable, that the world realized he had lived under a suffocating fear for 3 decades. Years of false living, false love, false smiles, all to preserve a career. Later, when asked if she regretted marrying Rock Hudson, Phyllis Gates answered in a brief CBS interview, "I don't regret it, but I do feel sorrow. Sorrow for him, a man who was never allowed to live truthfully, never allowed to love truthfully, and in the end was not even allowed to die in peace." And Rock Hudson was not the only one. There was another actor who also lived in the shadows for nearly half his life. He had shared a home with his male lover for 15 years, only to suddenly marry a woman after a party filled with rumors. But what shocked people even more was this: after the wedding, he continued paying the rent for that man's apartment for 8 full years. 7. Cary Grant and Diane Cannon, a wedding after 15 years of living with a male lover. On screen, Cary Grant appeared as the perfect image of a man, almost unbelievably so. From Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest to An Affair to Remember, not a single one of his roles failed to make female audiences swoon. He was always ranked among the big 4 leading men of classic Hollywood, alongside Clark Gable, James Stewart, and Gary Cooper. Yet off-screen, the image the public saw of Grant was always tightly controlled by the man himself. With just a smile, he could cleverly deflect any uncomfortable question. But behind the doors of the mansion on Crescent Drive in Beverly Hills for 15 long years, Cary Grant lived with another man, Randolph Scott, his co-star from the 1932 film Hot Saturday. They were not simply roommates. They spent vacations together at Malibu Beach, raised a dog, and regularly dined with celebrity couples such as Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. In 1934, Modern Screen magazine published a photo series titled Hollywood's Most Unusual Roommates, which showed the 2 men hanging laundry in the backyard, cooking meals together, and reading the Sunday newspaper side by side in an armchair. A year later, Photoplay ran a sly remark: "If you want to learn how to maintain a marriage, ask Cary Grant and Randolph Scott. Only thing is, they never got married." Grant stayed silent, and that silence lasted until 1965. That was when the media began digging up old files, especially after journalist Joe Hyams revealed a leaked note from a Warner Brothers meeting that mentioned Cary Grant's name alongside the words "sensitive image address" before PR backlash. At the same time, Universal Pictures realized that if the Grant-Scott story ever came to light, the entire gentlemanly leading man image they had spent years building would collapse in an instant. Just a week after Hyams's article, Cary Grant suddenly appeared on the cover of Life magazine holding hands with Diane Cannon, a young actress 33 years his junior, who was gaining attention at the time for her role in The Rise and Fall of Legs Diamond. The public could hardly believe it was real. Yet on July 22, 1965, the 2 were officially married at the Beverly Hills Hotel in front of 40 guests, including director Billy Wilder and singer Frank Sinatra. It was the only wedding in Grant's life where he personally invited the press to cover the event. One photographer later recalled, "I had shot over 200 Hollywood weddings, but this was the only time I saw a groom smile so much. He practically couldn't blink." A year later, Diane gave birth to their daughter Jennifer Grant. But marriage was no salvation. Within the very first year, Diane discovered that Carey was still secretly sending monthly financial support to Randolph Scott, who by then had moved to San Diego. The amount wasn't large, about $200 a month, but it continued steadily for nearly 8 years. In her personal diary leaked in 2010, Diane wrote one bitter line: "I didn't marry a man, I married a shadow, and that shadow took the shape of someone else." The marriage officially ended in 1968. John gained custody of their daughter, while Grant never remarried until near the end of his life, and he never once spoke of the past. However, in 1980, during his final interview with NBC before retiring, when asked if there was anything in his life that made him feel he had never truly been himself, Grant simply smiled, looked straight into the camera, and stayed silent. After that troubled marriage, Diane Cannon nearly withdrew from the film industry for a long time. Yet the biggest question she never answered publicly remained: did you know the truth before you married him? And for Hollywood, that same question would echo once more at another wedding, this time of a musical film star once worshipped across America as the embodiment of childhood innocence, but who married a director rumored to have been hiding behind a wedding suit for an entirely different reason. 8. Judy Garland and Vincente Minnelli, a marriage to conceal the director's homosexual past. On a summer afternoon in 1944, at MGM's Studio No. 5, when the smell of film stock still lingered in the air and the backstage lights had yet to fade, director Vincente Minnelli, a man with dark eyes, refined manners, and an impeccable sense of style as though he had stepped out of an Art Deco painting, was spotted carefully adjusting the bow tie on Judy Garland's collar. It was just a small gesture, but Hollywood's press seized on it as the opening shot for what would become one of the most intricately staged marriages in the history of American cinema. At that time, Judy Garland was already an A-list star thanks to The Wizard of Oz, while Minnelli had just made waves with Meet Me in St. Louis. In the eyes of the media, they were MGM's golden couple. Yet behind the glamour whispers had circulated in the industry for years that Vincente Minnelli had once been a regular at gay bars in Greenwich Village when he lived in New York, where he was known by a peculiar nickname that many still remember today: Miss V. According to the memoirs of screenwriter Charles Walters, who had worked with both of them, Minnelli had even been caught at a private party in Malibu wearing a red velvet gown fully made up and introducing himself under the alias Vivian. Though the photos were hidden away, the incident was nevertheless recorded by MGM boss Louis B. Mayer in the studio's secret personnel files, which he used to maintain control over stars during Hollywood's golden age. In early 1945, as Photoplay prepared to dig up the old story, a plan was drawn up. Mayer summoned both Garland and Minnelli to his private office and delivered one blunt ultimatum: "If you marry, I will erase everything from the files. If you don't, neither of you will have a place here." And so, on June 15, 1945, the wedding was held at Mayer's own home in Brentwood. There were no reporters, no celebrity guests, only a handful of managers and studio representatives. The entire ceremony lasted a mere 9 minutes. That night, Garland and Minnelli were booked into a corner suite on the 5th floor of the Chateau Marmont overlooking Sunset Strip. But according to hotel staff, Garland slept alone while Minnelli returned to the studio because he had urgent business with the art director. The marriage lasted nearly 6 years, long enough for Hollywood's press to believe it was true love. They had a daughter together, Liza Minnelli, who would later become one of the world's greatest musical theater stars. But in reality, she was the only bond holding together two people who never truly belonged to each other. In 1951, Garland discovered that her husband was still involved with a French costume designer living in West Hollywood, known in the circle as Pierre. And after catching her husband leaving the Bel Air Hotel with Pierre at 3 o'clock in the morning, Garland broke down and screamed at her manager, "I can't keep living as a mask anymore." She filed for divorce soon after. The marriage ended quietly, but it left deep scars in Garland's life. She began drinking heavily, grew dependent on sleeping pills, and often referred to such sham marriages as the Lavender trap, a cage that forced people to hide behind facades just to preserve an image. Yet Garland did not stop there, perhaps out of heartbreak, or perhaps out of a stubborn belief that love could mend the fractures. She stepped into another marriage. But this time, everything unfolded with dizzying speed and unraveled even faster. For the man she married next left her after only 5 months to pursue another man. 9. Judy Garland and Mark Herron, a marriage that fell apart. After 5 months when the husband ran off with a male lover. In 1964, at the age of 42, Judy Garland had already endured 3 failed marriages, a long series of emotional breakdowns, and had even been described by Variety as Hollywood's singing ghost. Yet during a return performance at the London Palladium, she happened to meet Mark Herron, a little-known stage actor 12 years her junior, who had once played a supporting role in a musical that most audiences could no longer even remember. At first, Herron was simply hired as Garland's assistant during her European tour, in charge of preparing costumes and managing her performance schedule. But only a few weeks later, the two suddenly appeared hand in hand on stage performing a duet together amid the cheers of the British audience. The press quickly dubbed Herron the 4th husband of Judy Garland. In reality, he was the 5th. On November 14, 1965 in Las Vegas, Garland and Herron held a hastily arranged wedding inside Frank Sinatra's private apartment. The ceremony took place at 11 p.m. with only 6 guests in attendance and a small white wedding cake that had been rushed in from the Flamingo Hotel. Garland wore a black dress, no makeup, and forced a smile as she cut the cake. After the ceremony, the couple flew straight back to Los Angeles and kept out of the media's sight for 3 weeks. But by the end of December, Mark Herron was spotted in the parking lot of the Lemel Theater in West Hollywood, embracing another man. None other than John Carlyle, a dancer who had once been the ex-boyfriend of Vincente Minnelli. The Hollywood Reporter immediately ran the headline, "Is History Repeating Itself?" while The Advocate mocked Herron as the stand-in of destiny. According to her daughter, Lorna Luft, Judy Garland, in a fit of rage, threw all of her husband's clothes into the swimming pool and phoned her manager to utter just one sentence: "I just married the ex-lover of the ex-lover of my ex-husband." That whirlwind marriage ended after exactly 5 months. No newspaper reported on the divorce, but in 1967, during a concert in Chicago, Garland quietly changed her introduction to a song with a line that left the entire hall in silence. "This is the song I once sang when I thought I was loved, but it turns out I was only chosen." What made it even more bitter was that right as Garland was struggling through the wreckage of her marriage, she could never have imagined that her most beloved daughter, Liza Minnelli, was also taking her very first steps into a Lavender marriage of her own. And in a cruel twist of fate, the man Liza was about to marry was none other than the former lover of Mark Herron, Judy Garland's ex-husband. 10. Liza Minnelli and Peter Allen, the Golden Girl of Hollywood, marries the former lover of her mother's ex-husband. In 1967, at just 21 years old, Liza Minnelli had already won a Tony Award for her leading role in Flora the Red Menace, earning her the title of Broadway's new musical theater princess. At that time, she was radiant, full of life, and carried the sparkling eyes of a younger version of her mother, the legendary Judy Garland. And it was precisely when her career was shining at its brightest that a romance began, one that would later be described as a fateful marriage, as twisted as her own family's history. Peter Allen, born in 1944 in Australia, was a singer and songwriter who had once been invited to open for Judy Garland shows. It was Garland herself who introduced Peter to her daughter after a performance in Miami Beach. In no time, the two grew close, at least on the surface. Liza once said that Peter was the only man who ever made me feel safe in the turbulent world of show business. They appeared together at the 1969 Academy Awards, holding hands as if they were about to live out a fairy tale romance. On March 3, 1967, they were married at the Riviera Hotel in Las Vegas. Liza wore a pristine white lace wedding dress, while Peter looked dashing in a silver-gray tuxedo. The wedding was partially funded by MGM, serving as a classic PR move to promote Hollywood's Golden Girl. People magazine hailed them as Broadway's new couple of America. But in truth, those closest to them knew it was nothing more than a carefully staged performance. According to the memoir of journalist Cindy Adams, who toured with Liza and Peter in 1971, Alan was once spotted at the bar of the Waldorf Astoria, accompanied by none other than John Carlyle, the dancer who had previously been the lover of Mark Herron, Judy Garland's ex-husband. Another source from The Advocate even claimed it was Mark Herron himself who had introduced Peter Allen to the backstage network of elite gay performers, a world where relationships often blurred the lines between art and compromise. Because of this, Liza's marriage was not just another Lavender marriage, but one heavily shadowed by a sense of historical betrayal. There was even a moment when Judy Garland reportedly shouted backstage at her daughter's show, "She's marrying a man who once slept with the very person that betrayed her mother." The marriage between Liza and Peter lasted only 7 years. In 1974, the couple quietly divorced. Peter Allen never publicly acknowledged his connection to Carlyle or to any other man, but beginning in 1978, he was seen exclusively in the company of male collaborators, never again mentioning his marriage to Liza. As for Liza Minnelli, she seemed destined to repeat her mother's tragedy. Multiple marriages, multiple divorces, and heartbreak after heartbreak with men who never truly loved her. Liza's story brings to mind another marriage, one that had taken place nearly half a century earlier. A world-famous leading man as handsome as if carved from stone was said to have sat alone weeping in the hallway outside his bridal suite just hours after the wedding, because the bride had locked the door and refused to enter the honeymoon bed. 11. Rudolph Valentino and Jean Acker. The bride locked the honeymoon suite. The groom wept in the hallway. In the early 1920s, Hollywood was still just a dusty town full of ambition, where an Italian man with deep-set eyes and a mesmerizing tango was slowly becoming the very first masculine icon on the silver screen. His name was Rudolph Valentino, and with only 2 films, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse and The Sheik, he was already hailed as the lover of 1,000 dreams. Yet right at the height of his career, Valentino stepped into a marriage so strange, it is still hard to believe. On November 6, 1919, he held a whirlwind wedding with actress Jean Acker, a sharp, striking woman who was rumored to have had ambiguous ties with Hollywood's circle of lesbian queens, including Alla Nazimova and Natasha Rambova. The wedding itself was a quiet affair at a Mission Revival church in Los Angeles, attended by only 3 friends. But what has fueled gossip to this very day was what happened afterward. On their wedding night, Valentino brought his new bride to the Alexandria Hotel, where he had reserved the most luxurious suite on the 3rd floor. Suddenly, Jean Acker slipped inside, closed the door, locked it from within, and never opened it again. Valentino knocked, called out her name, even pounded on the door for over 20 minutes, but no response ever came. According to hotel staff, Valentino sat slumped outside the door the entire night, while Jean wept alone inside the room. Years later, when asked why, Jean curtly replied, "I realized I had married the wrong person. Or perhaps the right person, but in the wrong gender." That marriage lasted only 6 hours, though it took 3 long years before the courts officially granted the divorce. During that time, Jean Acker openly lived with actress Grace Darman, while Valentino was rumored to have thrown himself into a string of fleeting affairs, seemingly desperate to prove he was still a real man. But many believed that night left a wound in Valentino's heart that never healed. A shame he could never wash away, no matter how many times he played the role of the ideal lover on screen. Perhaps it was because of that very humiliation that only a few years later Rudolph Valentino decided to start over with a second marriage, this time to a powerful and cunning woman who was also rumored to have orchestrated the entire first marriage performance as nothing more than a carefully staged publicity contract. 12. Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova, a second marriage full of calculation. After the humiliating failure of his brief marriage to Jean Acker, Rudolph Valentino seemed to have learned one thing in Hollywood. Love alone was never enough. Calculation was just as essential. And Natasha Rambova, the woman he chose for his second marriage, was the perfect embodiment of that second element. Natasha was not only a talented costume designer, but was also regarded as a master manipulator behind the scenes, so much so that people in the film industry whispered her nickname, the Sphinx of Sunset Boulevard. Sharp, intelligent, and deeply connected to Alla Nazimova, one of the most powerful lesbian moguls in Hollywood. At the time, Natasha was not someone to be underestimated. Valentino first met Natasha in 1921 during a photo shoot promoting the film Camille. That day, she wore a satin gown with a daring plunge drawing every camera lens in the room, yet her eyes focused on only one person, Rudolph. And when the two of them made their first public appearance together, Photoplay ran the headline, "The Idol Meets the Medium." Their romance ignited quickly, and only a few months later, they held a wedding in Mexico, despite the fact that Valentino had not yet officially finalized his divorce from Jean Acker. As a result, he was sentenced to 10 days in jail for illegal marriage, while Natasha boldly appeared on the cover of Motion Picture Classic with the caption, "The woman who broke the law to love America's Idol." Yet this marriage bore none of the hallmarks of a fairy tale. Natasha controlled everything from film contracts to costumes, even down to the fan letters Valentino was allowed to read. At one point, she even tore up an advertising contract with her own hands, declaring that Valentino's image had been commercialized to excess. Criticism began to mount. The Los Angeles Examiner dubbed her the Queen of Censorship, while director Rex Ingram publicly stated, if Valentino doesn't leave her, his career will be dead within 2 years. As predicted, only 3 years after their wedding in 1925, the couple announced their separation. Valentino was left in solitude, but his career unexpectedly surged once more. Tragically, only a year later, in August 1926, he died suddenly at the age of 31 from acute peritonitis. Natasha did not attend the funeral. Instead, she sent a short letter to the mortuary that read, "You were the gamble I once staked everything on," and then lost in silence. But Valentino was not the only star swept into marriages that never began with real love. Just a decade later, Hollywood would witness another bizarre wedding, one so strange that it did not even include a kiss. And the wedding night took place in a small room where a portrait of the groom's mother still hung above the bed. 13. Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor, a wedding without a kiss and a wedding night in the groom's childhood room. On May 14, 1939, while the entire United States was fixated on breaking news about the war in Europe, another event drew almost equal attention in Hollywood. Robert Taylor, hailed as the most handsome man on the planet, officially tied the knot with Barbara Stanwyck, the acclaimed actress who had already been nominated for the Oscar 3 years in a row. At first glance, it seemed like a picture-perfect Hollywood romance, two A-list stars, both of whom had consistently appeared on Photoplay magazine's list of golden couples. Yet the deeper one looked the stranger it appeared. Why had Stanwyck, who was 4 years older than Taylor, spent 3 years carefully evading every question about marriage? And why was their wedding held quietly without prior announcement at a small ranch in San Diego with only a handful of close friends in attendance? What has fueled whispers for decades is one seemingly minor detail. There wasn't a single kiss during the entire ceremony. No kiss on the lips, no cutting of the cake, no dancing. And the wedding night itself was even more peculiar. It took place in Robert Taylor's old family home in the very room where he had lived during his youth. In the modest 12-square-meter bedroom with a portrait of his mother hanging directly above the bed. Barbara sat reading a book, while Robert locked himself in the bathroom and did not emerge until the morning. One hotel staff member later recalled, "In all my life, I had never seen a honeymoon couple bring along an entire stack of movie scripts." Of course, nothing was ever officially confirmed. Yet by 1954, Confidential magazine reported that Taylor was a regular guest at private parties in Beverly Hills, gatherings attended exclusively by stars who could never live as their true selves. As for Barbara Stanwyck, she earned the nickname the Steel Woman, and from 1945 onward, she never once mentioned her husband in any interview. The marriage lasted exactly 12 years. No children, no scandals, and not a single photograph exists showing them holding hands outside of a film set. And if that marriage raised suspicions for its coldness, another couple went even further. They lived together their entire lives, and yet never once touched. A great composer, and a lady who would forever be remembered as the most faithful wife in Hollywood. 14. Cole Porter and Linda Lee Thomas, a lifelong marriage with a companion. In Hollywood, some couples married for fame, others wed to escape suspicion. But few were like Cole Porter, the musical genius behind more than 800 timeless songs, who entered marriage simply to preserve a friendship that would last a lifetime. In 1919, at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, a place often frequented by aristocrats and members of the artistic elite, a seemingly chance encounter sealed their destinies. Linda Lee Thomas, an elegant and wealthy socialite 8 years older than Porter, had already endured a scandalous marriage to media magnate Edward Thomas. And Cole Porter, a young man with bright, knowing eyes and a natural gift for music, carried within him a secret he could never reveal. Just 2 weeks after their first meeting, they held their wedding at the American Church in Paris. There was no press, no orchestra, no parents from either side. Yet, according to journalist Theodore White, that ceremony was like a pact between two souls who understood each other in a world that would never allow them to live truthfully. From then on, for the next 34 years, Linda stood by Cole through every important moment, from the premiere of his Broadway hit Anything Goes to the tragic horseback accident that left him nearly paralyzed for the rest of his life. She cared for him as a confidant, a mother figure, a devoted ally, but never as a lover. For Cole, as many backstage accounts reveal, was entangled in numerous affairs with young male dancers, including Boris Kochno, the close assistant of ballet legend Sergei Diaghilev. A document unearthed in Yale's archives in 2004 even preserved Porter's words to Linda. "I love you the way one loves freedom. You are my freedom." When Linda died of cancer in 1954, Cole did not attend her funeral. Instead, he shut himself inside his home, refusing to see anyone for 3 weeks. And just 1 year later, he would never compose another melody again. During those silent years of living with grief on a film set in Culver City, another love quietly bloomed. Discreet, unacknowledged by law, but enduring for nearly 3 decades. A bond so powerful it needed no piece of paper to hold it together. 15. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, 26 years together without a marriage certificate in a special relationship. In Hollywood, there are love stories that need no wedding ring, no vows of eternal devotion. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy were the clearest proof of that. Two legends of American cinema bound to each other for 26 years, yet they never once signed a marriage license, nor did they ever publicly acknowledge their relationship. It all began in 1941 on the set of Woman of the Year. At that time, Katharine was already a major star, while Spencer, a seasoned actor, was a married man. But after just one costume fitting, their eyes met, and from that moment on, neither of them could turn back. What shocked the public was not only that Spencer already had a wife, but also the unusual way this relationship was maintained. In nearly 3 decades together, they never shared a home. Catherine never once spent the night at Spencer's mansion, while he continued to keep his legal bond with his wife, Louise Treadwell, as though she were an untouchable shield. They appeared side by side on film sets at MGM's glamorous parties, but always with just enough distance to avoid the press cameras. And whenever asked, Catherine would simply smile and say, "I am a longtime friend. As for love, that is something I keep for myself." Yet the truth was something everyone already knew. Hepburn had turned down dozens of roles just to stay close to Tracy when he fell ill from alcoholism and kidney failure. For the last 5 years of his life, she was his caretaker, sleeping on a folding chair just outside his hospital room, and she was the one who witnessed his final breath in June 1967. What pierced people's hearts most was that after all those years, Catherine did not attend Spencer's funeral. She explained, "I didn't want to cause a disturbance. His wife was the one who should be there. As for me, I had already been with him for 26 years. And if their relationship was like a silent play that never needed to be announced, then the next story was a true tragicomedy. One where a Hollywood legend attempted to marry for the 8th time to a man no one could have imagined, as if building one final wall to shield herself from the unrelenting spotlight of the world. 16. Elizabeth Taylor and Larry Fortensky, the 8th marriage and the final wall. On the morning of October 6, 1991, as Elizabeth Taylor descended the white stone steps of Neverland Ranch in a custom-made Valentino wedding gown worth $25,000, the world could hardly believe what it was witnessing. The Queen of Hollywood was about to enter her 8th marriage, and this time the groom was nothing more than a construction worker 20 years her junior. Larry Fortensky, a man who had once worked as a security guard for Behr Paints, had never imagined that one day he would become the husband of Elizabeth Taylor. They had first met at the Betty Ford Center in 1988. One of them was struggling with alcohol and painkillers, while the other had just gone through her 7th divorce, physically and emotionally exhausted. Yet only a few months later, they began dating, sending shockwaves through Hollywood. The wedding took place at Michael Jackson's estate, attended by more than 160 prominent guests, including Liza Minnelli, Eddie Murphy, and even former First Lady Nancy Reagan. The press was barred from the gates while helicopters circled the California skies, desperate to capture a $1 million photograph. But what stirred the most public gossip was the prenuptial agreement that Taylor asked Fortensky to sign just 3 days before the ceremony. According to the contract, he would receive $1 million if they divorced after 5 years. And precisely in the 5th year, they parted ways. Throughout the marriage, Fortensky never once appeared on a red carpet, nor did he accompany Taylor to any film-related events. Elizabeth openly admitted, "I didn't marry him for fame. I married him because I needed someone who didn't care who I was. I needed a wall." After the divorce, Taylor still insisted that Larry was the kindest of all the men she had ever married. But everyone understood that this 8th wedding was, in truth, the final shield of a woman who had grown weary of the spotlight of constant scrutiny, judgment, and exploitation. And if Elizabeth Taylor married to build herself a protective wall, then the next man in our story entered marriage only to walk straight into prison. A literary genius, an arrogant rebel against the world, and a husband who drove his own wife to abandon her homeland in silent humiliation. 17. Oscar Wilde and Constance Mary Lloyd, the marriage that sent a genius to prison and drove his wife into exile. Among the most controversial marriages in history, the final story in today's video, the union between Oscar Wilde and Constance Mary Lloyd, stands as one of the most haunting tragedies. It did not take place in the glamorous world of Hollywood, but in the old dignified England, and yet its echoes left deep scars in both literature and the fight for human rights, becoming a bitter reminder of the price one pays for daring to live truthfully. On a May afternoon in 1884 at St. James's Church in London, Oscar Wilde, by then already a sensational figure in English literature, officially married Constance Mary Lloyd, a a middle-class, well-educated young woman who stood out in the early women's rights movements. The press hailed it as a civilized and exemplary marriage, while friends remarked that they looked as if they had just stepped out of a Shakespearean play. But that was only the surface. On their wedding night, Constance quickly sensed a troubling distance. Oscar, often portrayed by the newspapers as a ladies' man, appeared cold and detached. He could spend hours passionately discussing art, yet when left alone with his wife, he avoided her gaze. Later, they would have 2 sons together, but private letters preserved in the British Library reveal that Wilde once confided to a friend, "I love beauty, but not the kind of beauty that can bear children. I love the soul rather than the body, and my body does not desire Constance." By the late 1890s, rumors began to engulf Oscar Wilde. At lavish parties in London's West End, whispers spread about his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, a young aristocrat strikingly handsome, almost sculptural, and notorious for his recklessness. Douglas's mother called Wilde a seducer with words, while his father, the Marquis of Queensberry, went so far as to write a letter condemning Wilde as a man of intolerable habits. In February 1895, Oscar Wilde was formally charged with acts of gross indecency. The press at the time dared not spell it out, but everyone understood the implication. During the 3-week trial, Constance never appeared. Instead, she quietly took their 2 sons, left England, changed their names, and lived in exile in Switzerland. In 1898, she died alone under another surname, never once speaking of her husband again from the day he was sentenced. After serving 2 years of hard labor at Reading Jail, Oscar Wilde wrote De Profundis, a 50,000-word letter to Alfred Douglas. In it, he never mentioned Constance, offered no apology, and gave no explanation. He simply left behind one quiet, bitter admission: all tragedies are initiated by a glass of champagne, a smile, and a wedding. 17 weddings, 17 stories, yet all sharing one thing in common. Each was carefully staged to conceal a truth that the era simply did not allow to be spoken aloud. In the old days of Hollywood, a single admission of being homosexual was enough to destroy your career overnight. You would lose your contracts, lose your reputation, and sometimes even lose the right to live as your true self. That is why they chose to marry. Not out of love, but for survival. Not out of trust, but out of the desperate need to protect the spotlight, the very glory they had sacrificed their youth to achieve. And so, a haunting question remains: if society back then had allowed them to live authentically, how many of these weddings would still have been unions born from genuine love? And what about you? After hearing all 17 names, which one shocked you the most? Was there a face you once believed represented a beautiful love story, only to discover now that it was nothing more than a dazzling facade? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe this video deserves to be spread, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next hidden secrets waiting to be revealed.